Good evening, everybody. We're going to give a little bit, one more minute for people to join from the waiting room. See, a lot of people are joining. Good evening. Welcome to the Dallas Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority. Welcome to our Housing Discrimination webinar, Home for the Holidays. Tonight, we'll be discussing housing discrimination, redlining, and predatory lending. My name is Attorney Elisa Patterson, and I'm attorney here in the area. I want to welcome our beautiful chapter president, Dr. Andrea Hilburn. She's our second term president. We're so happy to have her here tonight. She's a gracious leader of our chapter. We want to thank her for being here with us, and she will be opening up our program tonight. Welcome, Dr. Andrea Hilburn. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Patterson. I am going to probably repeat some of the things that Ms. Patterson has already stated. This is the Dallas Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. We welcome you to the Home for the Holidays, the social action virtual panel discussion on housing discrimination, predatory lending, and redlining is hosted by the Social Action Committee chaired by Judge Valencia Nash Mcgee. We seek to gain a wealth of information from our panelists to impact and inform. The panelists are Broxdale Higgins, Fair Housing Administrator, City of Dallas, James Mcgee, President and Chair, Southern Dallas Progress Community Development, and Dr. Marion Egoof, Vice President of Policy and Research of Dallas Housing Authority. Serving as moderators tonight is Beverly Davis, retired Director of Fair Housing City of Dallas, and attorney Elisa Patterson, Dallas Alumni Chapter Co-Chair. Please note that all information shared on this webinar is for informational purposes only. It is not intended as a substitute for specifics to your personal situation. We are grateful that you have joined us this evening. Take notes and become knowledgeable on fair housing. Thank you. Enjoy the evening.
Thank you, Madam President. Next, we will have the Honorable Judge Valencia Nash. She's one of our dedicated public servants here in Dallas County, Justice of the Peace, been in her position for many years. She's our gracious leader of one of our biggest committees here in the chapter, Social Action. You know, Deltas love registering voters, getting out, impacting the community. Serving, that's what we do. A big key of our organization is social action. So we're so gracious to have her here. She's going to bring up greetings from the Social Action Committee. Welcome, Judge Valencia Nash.
Thank you, Sarah Patterson, and thank you, Sarah Davis, for moderating tonight's event. We think from the Social Action Committee of Dallas Alumni that we need to address hot topics, and we know that this is one of the topics facing our community. So we are appreciative of all of our panelists tonight, and we hope that our guests who are attending will have some information to take away and hopefully some resolutions to our issues here in Dallas County. Without saying anything further and to get this program started, welcome and thank you for attending.
Thank you so much, Judge Nash. So we just want to lay out a few ground rules for tonight. We have our lovely chat monitor, Bridget Nevels. She's going to be monitoring the chat and the Q&A. We're going to ask all of you all in the virtual environment to please put your questions in the Q&A. This is a two-part webinar, so you'll hear information from our keynote panelists here tonight, and then we're going to open it up to the public. So write down, jot down what you want to ask these experts in this field, and we'll ask you again. I know it's easier to put it in the chat, but we would like you to direct it to the Q&A section so the panelists can see what you're directly asking them. So we're going to open it up with introductions. Sarah Beverly Davis.
Thank you, Sarah Lisa. I am so excited that we're bringing this very important topic to the public today. And we have an outstanding panel who are experts in all of the issues that we're going to discuss. Some of you may be thinking, why housing discrimination? And if you think back, for those of you who were around in the 60s, and I know a lot of you weren't, but those of you who studied history know that it was in 1968 that Dr. King fought hard to get the Fair Housing Act passed. And unfortunately, it did not get signed into law until the week after he was assassinated in April of 1968. And so here we are today, 53 years later, still grappling with issues related to housing and discrimination in housing, redlining, predatory lending. And so without any further ado, I would like to introduce you to our panelists. I am going to just do a brief introduction, and then I'm going to allow them to say something about themselves so that you can better have an idea of what they bring to this discussion. So I'm going to start with Broxdale Higgins, who is the Fair Housing Administrator for the City of Dallas, who is responsible for ensuring that federal and local laws in fair housing are enforced. And then we have James Mcgee, who is the President and Chair of Southern Dallas Progress, which is a community development corporation that is very active in the community in empowering the community for economic development, for housing, and to ensure that there is fairness in all aspects of housing, economic development, and any other benefits that the communities are entitled to. And then, of course, last but not least, Dr. Miriam Iguf, who is a researcher, and also she's Vice President of Policy and Research for the Dallas Housing Authority. So Miriam, since I ended there with you, I'm just briefly tell us a little bit about yourself, and we'll do that, and I'll allow each one of you to do that, and then when we come back around, you can make your overall presentation.
Okay, so hi everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to share some of my work and my thoughts with you all tonight. So as Beverly mentioned, I am the Vice President of Policy Development and Research at the Dallas Housing Authority. And in a nutshell, my work really revolves around how do we use research findings and knowledge to change the world out there, right? So how do we operationalize responses to address inequities, social challenges, and of course, just the housing issues that our local jurisdiction and region are facing. So that is me in a nutshell.
Okay, James.
James Mcgee, President Board Chair of Southern Dallas Progress. Southern Dallas Progress focuses on high poverty, high minority areas below Interstate 30. I actually am a former banking compliance officer turned nonprofit.
Okay, Barksdale.
Good evening, ladies of Delta. And I certainly want to thank the alumni chapter for inviting me and allowing me to speak to your group this evening. I hope I can at least share some information that will bring some value to the discussion this evening. And I'd like to thank all the other guests who are in attendance as well. My name is Broxdale Higgins, and I'm the administrator for the City of Dallas Fair Housing Division under the Office of Equity and Inclusion. We're an enforcement agency that basically investigates complaints of housing discrimination. I'd like to add at least that I had the good fortune, pleasure, and blessing of working very closely with your soror here, Mrs. Beverly Davis. She was my superior. She ran the office, and we miss her so dearly. And she really did a phenomenal job during her tenure here with the city of Dallas. So I'm hoping, those are some big shoes that I have to fill. So I'm trying to do the best that I can, but I certainly want to thank you all for allowing me to participate this evening.
Okay, Broxdale, thank you so much for all those kind words. And so since we just ended with you, would you go ahead and just give us an overview of what fair housing is and explain what the law is in regards to who is protected under the law for housing discrimination?
Yes, ma'am. Basically, the subject of fair housing or the law itself deals with any type of discriminatory or differential treatment that a person would experience in their attempt to purchase housing or to rent housing or to avail themselves of a housing-related service if they have been mistreated or discriminated in some manner because of their membership in any one of 7 protected classes. Those protected classes are race, color, religion, national origin, sex, meaning gender, familial status, and disability or handicap. Now, those protected classes are recognized across the board nationally. So anywhere you go in this country, you have those rights and are protected under the Federal Fair Housing Act. I don't care if you're here in Dallas or you're in Tupelo, Mississippi, or Anchorage, Alaska. Those laws apply anywhere you go. Now, bear in mind, there's one thing that I'd like to share in the fact that even though we have the Federal Fair Housing Act, a local municipality can establish their own fair housing laws, or a state government or entity can also adopt their own fair housing laws. Now, if you see entities such as that adopt fair housing, they have to have the 7 that are recognized under the Federal Fair Housing Act. However, they can establish additional protected classes as well. So here in Dallas, we have additional protected classes, one for source of income. In addition to that, we have a separate ordinance that address housing discrimination for people based upon issues related to sexual orientation, gender identity, transgender status. You can go as far as to the West Coast, California, or in Washington State. They may have as many as 20 protected classes because naturally they deem themselves to be much more progressive in leading the way in these efforts. Washington, D.C., I think they have as many as, maybe 14 or in the teens. So it behooves anyone to be aware of the local fair housing laws, wherever they may reside or may be visiting, or if you have family members that live outside of the Dallas Metroplex or outside of the state of Texas. Now, one thing I want to touch on, it's easy to understand that a person can be discriminated in their attempt to secure housing if they're trying to rent housing or trying to purchase a home. But what does it mean if someone is being discriminated in some manner if they're trying to secure some type of housing-related service? What's the housing-related service that would be addressed and covered under the Act? Well, if we're talking about situations where someone is trying to rent a dwelling, a housing-related service could be something as simple as asking for a maintenance service. So if I live at the Algonquian apartment complex and I have an issue with my sink and I call the rental office and I say, look, my sink is, it's stopped up, the water's not going down. And if they fail to provide that service to me because of my membership in any one of the protected classes, because of my race, or because of the color or complexion of my skin, or if because of my gender, they may very well be in violation and have violated my rights. Another housing-related service may be access to the swimming pool, or access to the laundry room, or access to being able just to get my mail. That would be a housing-related service because, of course, if I can't avail myself of that service, I can't enjoy my dwelling. Now, let me touch on a few things because I would imagine most of you Delta women, y'all own your homes, y'all not out there renting. So when we look at housing-related service that may pertain to the purchase of home or you being able to inhabit a home that you have purchased, a housing-related service could be something as simple as trying to secure a mortgage. Because if you can't secure that mortgage, you can't purchase that home. So if you feel that you have been given burdened in some way or discriminated in some manner in trying to secure that mortgage, your rights may have been violated under the Fair Housing Act. What do you think would be another housing-related service involved in the purchase of a home? How about homeowners insurance? Because unless you're flush with cash and you got deep pockets, and I know some of you Deltas may be, but for those of us who don't, we have to go to a lending institution or a bank to secure a loan. So in doing so, that bank wants to protect its collateral. And so they're going to make sure that that home has insurance. So if I go and I need homeowners insurance so I can purchase that home, and they in some way create extra burdens for me or makes it difficult for me to get that homeowners insurance, and they do so, and I'm affected in that way because of my membership in one of the protected classes, my rights may have very well have been violated under the Fair Housing Act. Because look, if I can't get the homeowners insurance, can't get the loan, can't get the loan, can't purchase the home. But let me talk about something else that may directly affect the women of Delta. Let's just say you live in a neighborhood where there's a neighborhood association, or you live in a condominium community. And as some of you know that live in these types of neighborhood and these types of community, they have bylaws and rules and policies, some of them quite strict and can appear burdensome, but they appear across the board to everybody. So again, if they have rules that apply to everyone, even though you may feel that they are burdensome, that would not be a violation of the Fair Housing Act. That you may have some other remedies under the law, but you would not have any protections under the Fair Housing Act. But let's just look at something as simple as you putting a sign in your yard promoting that you're Delta, or that you're going to have some event, or you just have some signage that says Delta Sigma Theta, or you have something up on your door, and that's a violation of their policy. They issue you a fine for having it because you haven't taken it down. So let's just say you live in a community that's quite inclusive. You have people from various backgrounds and ethnicities there. And then there's a house right down the street. And the woman that lives in that household, she pledged and is a member of Delta, Delta, Delta. She didn't have the, the pleasure and the benefit of becoming a Delta Sigma Theta. She had to, settle for being a member of Delta, Delta, Delta. So under those circumstances, that sorority is predominantly white. If she has signage up in her yard or in her home and they don't fine her for having her signage up, but they fine one of you for having yours up, that could potentially be a fair housing issue based upon race. So something as simple as that we, would sort of ignore, wouldn't realize that we have rights, or at least some issue that we need to certainly bring to the attention of those who may be imposing these types of rules or policies on us. You may very well have at least the right to have an entity such as mine look into it. My office, we are an entity within the city of Dallas, and we are responsible for enforcing not only the city's fair housing ordinance, but the National Fair Housing Act. Our office is substantially equivalent with HUD. We have been certified to act in HUD's stead to investigate any complaints of housing discrimination that happen within the city limits of Dallas. So that's the only thing that we can address. Now, of course, if you live in one of the other localities, one of the other cities, and you call our office, we'll try to provide the best assistance that we can as a courtesy. But we really don't have jurisdiction or authority to open a complaint and investigate those issues, let's just say in Plano or Frisco or in Cedar Hill or DeSoto. You still have the ability to file a complaint. You could contact HUD. They will either take the complaint and investigate it themselves, or they may refer the case to the Texas Workforce Commission. That entity has authority and jurisdiction to investigate complaints throughout the entire state of Texas. They are a state entity. Our authority is only within the city of Dallas. So again, the Fair Housing Act, or the subject of fair housing, deals with any issues of discrimination or differential treatment that a person would experience in trying to purchase a home, rent a home, or avail themselves of some type of housing related service. And they feel that they have been treated in this manner because of their membership in any one of the 7 protected classes. And I'm going to repeat them again: race, color, national origin, religion, sex, familial status, and handicap or disability. Ms. Davis, would you like for me to go more in detail with each of the protected classes, or is that enough information for right now?
For right now, Broxdale, that's enough. You've done a great job. We may come back with you to get more details about that.
Okay.
But we're going to go on and expand the conversation a little bit. As Broxdale explained, the Fair Housing Act outlined protected classes, and it set out what the law was in terms of protecting the rights of those who have been discriminated in the past, in the attempt to ensure that everyone had housing rights. But there was also a second part of the act, and it is known as affirmatively furthering fair housing. And the second part of the Fair Housing Act says that those that receive federal funds must take actions to affirmatively further fair housing. So what that means is that at the time that the Fair Housing Act was passed in the 1960s, if those of you who have studied history, we had riots in places like Watts and Newark and really all over the United States because of the deplorable conditions that people were forced to live in the ghettos and so forth. And so the legislators and activists knew at the time that it wasn't enough to just say, stop discriminating. There needed to be steps taken to remedy the past discrimination that had already occurred. And so this is where our expert, Dr. Iguf, comes in, because her expertise is in looking at the data and presenting the data to us on discrimination. So she is going to now give us a presentation so that we can see what it looks like in this North Texas region. So Dr. Iguf, at this time, I'm going to turn it over for you to do your presentation.
Very well. Thank you so much, Beverly. And I hope everybody can see my screen. Again, thank you for the opportunity to share some of my work and thoughts tonight. Let's get going. And it's purposefully titled From Knowing to Doing, because I usually give a lot of presentations around all the problems that we have in Dallas and North Texas, but I'm really honored tonight to present some of the work that we've done around affirmatively furthering fair housing. So again, as a quick synopsis, my role is to innovate in the realm of public policy, equity, and I do this in the affordable housing industry. So again, bridging the world of research, data, and practice, that is operations. So as Ms. Davis mentioned, a very important facet of fair housing is the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule. And a few years ago, the federal government required grantees, so cities, states, public housing authorities, counties receiving dollars to conduct an assessment of fair housing. An assessment of fair housing is a data-driven exercise to quantify, measure, look at spatial patterns with respect to poverty concentration, segregation, disproportionalities, and really altogether disparities. And I have to really highlight the amazing work that Beverly has done, because she has championed the largest assessment in the country for the Dallas DFW region. And we continued the assessment despite the shift in the administration no longer requiring this assessment. Because we were committed to this very meaningful and consequential exercise, we decided to move forward. And this despite the fact that this big assessment was no longer required. So the assessment, again, identified housing challenges, but also policies on how do we address these issues. So it's a big map. I won't have the time to go through it, but we can go through it maybe afterwards. But what it shows is that the neighborhoods who are characterized by minority concentration and poverty concentration, really segregation, both economic and along racial lines, doubled in the city of Dallas in a matter of one generation, but also persisted across a full generation. So a really sobering picture about those very ingrained pockets of poverty concentration and racial segregation. This was a big finding of the assessment. Another big finding of the assessment is that we have found that voucher holders, formerly known as Section 8 families, tend to live in the most segregated neighborhoods, which is absolutely contrary to the intent of the program, right? And so the assessment has found, unfortunately, a pretty stark geography of inequity in Dallas, but also in the DFW area. I'm going to go through, unfortunately, this very sobering picture of the state of housing in our city and region. So the assessment has found growing racial and ethnic, as well as economic segregation since 1990 to 2016 at the time of completion of the study. We have found racial and ethnic inequities, affordability pressures, systemic barriers to access to opportunity, an increased level of segregation. Importantly, the proliferation of recaps, racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty. So these pockets that I mentioned, extreme poverty and racial segregation. And so you might say, okay, another pretty sobering, not really flattering study showing that we have, historical, deeply ingrained problem. So what do we do about this? Well, I would say that to do something about this, we have to change the way we operate. So we have to go through transformational operational shifts as governmental agencies and leaders in the realm of housing. And we need to have some very targeted and intentional initiatives. So today I want to brag about a super cool program that we designed at DHA that is called Children First North Texas, or CFNTX. And the program is geared towards giving, if you will, a super voucher to families living in those recap areas, right? Those racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty. So we would give them a super voucher, which is worth more, with the provision of housing mobility counseling too. So it's a little bit distinctive approach on our end, where the housing authority is actually a partner in the housing search process, which is usually not the case. And we also provide a set of incentive for the landlords to accept the vouchers. And so this Children First North Texas is really geared towards providing previously denied housing opportunities to those who live in those very impoverished, low upward mobility rate neighborhoods in the DFW area. And the Dallas Housing Authority committed $3 million through this program, and we're really pumped about the possibilities of doing more than that. Because guess what? Not too long ago, which is in April 2021, President Biden requested that a Children First North Texas-like program be actually deployed and funded nationwide. And I think the important point that I'm trying to make here is, if you recall, I mentioned that the fair housing assessment was no longer required. And yet we decided to intentionally continue the work. We are not waiting for, let's say, a federal mandate to do the work locally. So I think it's important to not wait for federal prescription to do what's right, but we also have to be ourselves innovators and deploying the resources where needed. So innovate locally, serve your communities. This is one cool program that I'm really pumped about. Another one, as you know, the pandemic has been devastating in terms of human loss, the economic impact. Very, very difficult for cities, states, counties to respond to the housing impact of the pandemic. And when the first wave of federal assistance came about, the city worked on deploying the funds to vulnerable populations. Unfortunately, early efforts have shown that they had a hard time reaching those chronically disinvested neighborhoods. And so they turned to different partners to try to reach these communities. And DHA received $4.5 million to administer to communities. And here again, I want to show you how we have used our knowledge of inequities, fair housing disparities, and changed the way we operate conventionally to do more than just business as usual, let's say. So I know it's supercharged as a slide, but one thing that we have done is to develop a one-of-a-kind model that is data-driven and really focused on equity. And instead of doing a first-come, first-serve approach, we focused on, if you want, securing or putting aside resources for neighborhoods that were deemed vulnerable. And that approach allowed us to make sure that resources are not consumed or depleted by maybe more affluent neighborhoods, and that we give a fair chance to those who chronically, historically, really don't see resources coming their way. And so we accounted for, again, spatial disparities. We made our system multilingual. We used automation. We used AI. And again, this was one of the very first model to account for the fair housing landscape or the inequitable landscape when providing housing assistance in a time of crisis. So I'm going to brag for a quick second because we work so hard and seldom do we get the chance to share the work that we do. But we did receive some national coverage, including some from the Wall Street Journal, highlighting how government can reckon with that legacy of disinvestment and intentionally change the way we do business to reach those vulnerable population. And we're also proud to say that we have seen our model emulated in other cities and counties across the country. Again, accounting for fair housing disparities to change the way we operate as governmental agency. So I know it's a lot of information and we're limited on time. So this is how I'm going to conclude my 5-6 minute talk. And back to you, Davis. Thank you, Beverly.
Thank you so much, Miriam, Dr. Igu, for that presentation. And so at this time, we're going to ask James Mcgee to make his presentation. And some of you may recognize James because he has been on Channel 8 quite a few times over the last few months. So James, would you go ahead and start your presentation?
Sure. Like I said, over the past year, we've been focusing on the Banking Below 30 series as far as banks redlining Southern Dallas. And I wanted to share one of the latest stories in which aired on Sunday. And I think it's a real game changer and a real solution to the redlining problem and holding banks accountable.
When banks intentionally deny credit to lower income and minority neighborhoods, it's called redlining. And over the last year, our Banking Below 30 reports have revealed the many ways that redlining is alive and well in Texas. And we've introduced you to people like James Mcgee. He's a former bank compliance officer who runs a nonprofit that reinvests in historically underserved neighborhoods in Southern Dallas.
Your profile's a lot higher through these stories, isn't it, than it used to be?
Yes, it is.
Has that been helpful for you?
Yes, it has.
Lately, James has been focused on a 22-year-old piece of legislation that created the Texas Community Reinvestment Work Group. Its mission is to develop strategies that encourage financial institutions to lend money to Texas's low-income and moderate-income families and individuals. The work group pulls together powerful state agencies like the Department of Banking, the Comptroller, and the Department of Housing. Also at the table are federal bank regulators from the Comptroller of the Currency, the Federal Reserve Bank, and the FDIC.
What do you think about that concept in general?
I mean, I think it's a great concept. I mean, I'm very impressed by the concept. And I think collectively working together as for developing a strategy, I mean, it's how you move technically the entire state forward.
But as James discovered, there's a problem. By law, these state agencies and federal regulators are supposed to meet quarterly and look for ways to improve access to credit for low-income and minority communities. But in reality, they haven't met a single time in the last 4 years.
So why did the group stop meeting? Well, a representative of the Texas Comptroller's office said because it no longer served a purpose.
The fact is you've got to have someone, persons from the legislative branch of government saying, hey, you have a responsibility to do this, and you're not doing it.
After Democratic State Senator Royce West intervened, state officials have agreed to reboot the work group. West says he expects the group will collaborate with the banking industry to recommend new rules and legislation that encourage banks to lend.
Has the reporting elevated the conversation?
Yes, because again, they knew that the eye of the media was on them, frankly. And how can you justify having something put in law back in 1999 and it's defunct?
But this time, it won't just be bureaucrats and regulators at the table. James Mcgee will be there too. He's been invited as a special guest for his real-world perspective about how banks deny credit to minority communities and how to fix the problem.
Is it your feeling that there's real potential in this working group?
Yes, I think there's tremendous potential, in this working group. And I, hope they will continue to, invite me back and so we can work on a strategy together and then execute that strategy also.
The group's first meeting in 4 years is scheduled for January. I'm David Schechter reporting.
Great. Okay, so James, would you like to, I think you have at least a couple of minutes. Would you like to expand on that a little bit more? And specifically, I know you've also been involved with monitoring banks who have a responsibility under the Reinvestment Act to invest within minority communities. And I think that's how this series kind of got started, is that the Community Reinvestment Act was really not being enforced within the North Texas area. So could you expand on that a little bit?
Yes, so we identified a total of 17 banks that were not including Southern Dallas in what they call their assessment area. And so we are working, actually before the end of the year, we're going to file a HUD complaint on that particular bank. There's going to be 17 continuously complaints going into the beginning of next year. So I think that's going to be one of the important things, is to file that complaint that'll be referred to the Department of Justice and holding those banks accountable.
Great, great. So what has happened as a result of this series, Banking Below 30? We saw that this group that had not met in 4 years is now meeting, but are you hearing anything from any of the other banks in general? Are they stepping up their game any to try to meet the challenge?
Yes, so from a banking regulator standpoint, I've talked to all the regulators in regards to the stories. They convened some special meetings internally. From the banking perspective, a lot of those banks have reached out to me as far as how do they do better. And you do have some of the banks that are honestly not reaching out and don't want to do better. So it's been a mixed array of things going on. But the attention and accountability, I think is what we need to do and keep it there.
Anything else you want to talk about your organization, James? What does your organization do?
So we are, overall, as for the organization, we focus on financial education, small building development, and then housing from a housing standpoint. But all of that, capital plays a part in discrimination. So that's why, we've kind of combined that as far as, banking and economic justice.
What made you get into this? What personally drove you for this?
Oh, I got tired of when I was working at the bank, I would try to give them suggestions. I grew up in South Dallas and Pleasant Grove. I would try to give them suggestions as far as what would move the community forward. And so in a sense, they wouldn't listen. So I decided to get on the other side of the nonprofit. It's more rewarding. And then how do you take that to action? And it's been impactful.
Thank you so much. We're going to move on to some of the directed questions that we pre-submitted to you all attendees. We kind of think of some questions to gauge the panelists that, really focus on what they do on a daily. So we're going to hit a couple of those, and then we see a lot of questions in the Q&A. We're doing good on time. We're going to ask a few of these, and then we're going to, our last hour, moving to open it up to you all. Mr. Broxdale Higgins, as a fair housing administrator for the city of Dallas, you're responsible for fair housing enforcement of the city, 1.4 million residents of the city of Dallas. What is your greatest challenge that you've seen in fair housing enforcement in 2021? So what's going on with the city? I used to work for the city. Tell us what's going on. Please unmute.
I apologize. That's a good question and really an interesting one. There is a trend that we're seeing, and really is nothing recent. We started seeing some activity in this area, and I'm going to explain more in a moment. Probably more so starting around 3 to 4 years ago. Many of the older multifamily housing complexes, not many, some of which you may see in and around the city, particularly some in the southern sector, they were created as affordable housing for people specifically who are elderly and disabled. They were able to get funding from the state and approved from the city for a land use restrictive agreement and have a LIHTC project, low income housing tax credits, to help them in actually, financing and getting tax credit on these properties. Many of those LURAs or land use restrictive agreements are now either terminating or coming close to termination. And what we have seen and continue to see, especially with the hot housing market that we are experiencing here in North Texas, is that new owners are coming in to purchase these complexes. And in doing so, once these land use restrictive agreements terminate, they are free to run and operate these properties as they see fit. They are not restricted by the contractual requirements that are under the agreement. And so in doing so, they are not setting their rents at affordable rates for the tenants that actually inhabit or live in these properties when they acquire them. And actually, after these new owners take over the properties, they are setting their rent rates at market rate, which can be anywhere for a one bedroom from $1,000 up to maybe $1,600, and a two bedroom from anywhere from $1,200 up to $2,000. Where naturally these people, elderly people, and those, of course, who are disabled, they're on fixed incomes. They can't afford this increase, this significant increase in their rental rates. So it has really created a conundrum for our office to have to deal with, because in looking at these types of business models that these new owners are trying to institute and impose on their tenants, on the face of it, it would not appear to be a fair housing issue, because they are doing this, they are imposing this new criteria on all of their tenants. It's not like they're singling out a set of tenants based on their membership in a protected class. However, there may be options available to try to assist these tenants. Some of the things that we would look at, first of all, if any are disabled and those who are disabled, to encourage them to make a request for a reasonable accommodation. People who are disabled and have special needs may make a request for a housing provider to relax policies, rules, business practices to be able to afford that person to make full use and enjoyment of their living space, of their dwelling. Now, the thing that sort of challenges or creates difficulty in trying to allow these tenants to be able to take full advantage of that, housing providers, they are not mandated if they have a legitimate business excuse as to why they cannot accommodate that tenant, or if they have other options available to them to try to offer to that tenant, as opposed to directly providing that tenant with the accommodation request that they have asked or that they have made. So that's one option that we look at. Another would be if what the new owner or housing provider is imposing upon these tenants would create a disparate impact. Now, that's a legal theory where a housing provider may be imposing a rule or a policy or some type of business model that appears to be neutral on its face, is not created with the intent to discriminate against anybody. However, it does create a burden on a certain segment of their population in their community. And in doing so, it creates a disparate or a burdensome impact. And so under those circumstances, those tenants or that tenant may be able to make a complaint based upon that theory. Now, the challenge with that is so much harder to prove than just a typical fair housing complaint where someone is saying, this person mistreated me or discriminated against me with the intent to do so because of my membership in a protected class. But this is really is quite a challenge that like I say, we've seen, and it has started to sort of surface about 4 years ago, where new owners are coming in, they're trying to take advantage of this market. And look, let's be honest here, and I'm going to share something. This may be just my personal opinion, but what I've seen here in this area, there's a spirit of greed, and these people really don't take into consideration the impact of some of the decisions that they make. Their only focus is on the bottom line and how much money that they can make. And, in a lot of ways, it's horrible, because it really does create situations where people may end up homeless. It puts the tenants who are in these situations in a terrible position of angst and frustration and just worry. They don't know what to do, because naturally they can't afford these increased rents. And with the market being the way it is now, it's hard for them to find affordable housing elsewhere. So we're trying to do everything we can in our office, as well as working with other entities, such as DHA, as well as HUD, to try to find solutions to assist these tenants.
Okay, we're going to move on to the Q&A. Thank you all for putting them in. Panelists, please keep your responses down to about 20 to 30 seconds. We've got a lot of questions in here. So I'll start with our one from, well, this one's back to you, Mr. Higgins. We want to keep this really short. How hard is it to prove that a tenant has been discriminated against? What percentage of cases has DHA won on behalf of their tenants, if you can answer that?
Interesting question, but we're not DHA, we're with Fair Housing Division. DHA, they don't deal with housing discrimination. That would vary, and the point I want to make, and I know you want me to keep this succinct and short, our office only investigates the complaints. We will meet with the complaining party, the person files the complaint, take their information, and accept all evidence that they have to support their allegations. We will also contact that entity or that person who is alleged to have discriminated and get their information. We then provide all of the evidence and information that we collect, along with a summary, up to the city attorney's office, who will then review and evaluate it. And they will make the determination as to whether there's been a violation of that person's rights, and as well as the city's fair housing ordinance. So we really don't make that decision. But what I would say in terms of percentages, I would say for the most part, because again, another point that really needs to be driven home, filing a complaint with our office is no different than filing a civil suit in court. There are certain legal criteria that complaining party, or a burden of proof, that they must meet. Now, we try to assist in collecting the information to help them meet that burden. However, but if the burden is not met, the city attorney's office will not make a determination to find that there is a violation. On the whole, I would say we average about 5% of the cases that go up that we're able to find cause or a violation on. The others, we try to work with the parties to resolve through a settlement or resolution that we identify or call conciliation.
Okay, well, thank you, Broxdale. And thank you for giving us a very thorough answer. As much as possible, we're going to try to keep the answers more succinct so that we can get through a lot more of the questions. But I thank you for giving that detailed answer. So we're going to go to another question. We had a question from someone who mentioned that there was a study that was released by the city this week, looking at the housing policy for the city through an equity lens. And so the question is asking the panelists, what is your reaction to the city study that was released this week? So Dr. Igoof, would you like to take a stab at that one?
Yeah, if we can stop the recording for a second. No, I mean, to be perfectly candid, I think this is a prime example of dissociating housing from fair housing. I think and so a synopsis for those who are not aware, the big finding was that housing policy does not do enough and is not really equitable, there's no strategy to truthfully address housing inequities. And Beverly knows as much as I know, when the housing policy was being developed, we were producing the fair housing assessment. So these two very important documents were concurrently being built, but unfortunately, we have not been collaborating. We did not get an invite when the housing policy was being developed, although we have extended, that we thought that some of the fair housing impediments being found needed to be taken into account when drafting the housing policy. So I think this is, again, a prime example of thinking that fair housing is separate from housing, or housing is separate from fair housing. The other one kind of goes back to my earlier thoughts, which is you're going to have to demonstrate intentionality in your policies. And I think there's some work to be done on the city's front for that.
Okay. James, would you like to have any comment on that?
Sure. I did see a copy of the study. I think it's just clearly wrote out what we already know. And there was no plan of action, and hasn't been a plan of action since the initial policy was issued. And we already knew we have too many apartments and we need to build more for sale housing. So,
so you say there's really nothing new in the report. And, very often organizations get accused of hiring consultants to give reports on things that may be somewhat obvious. And so how would you say, what do we need to do as a community to hold our government and other organizations accountable once these studies are done and these reports are done? How can we take action to hold our leaders and our governments accountable?
I think one easy step is to, make the requirement to demonstrate that work has been done to address the findings of the report that has been published. Again, I can speak for DHA, but once the fair housing assessment was published, we created an office to address fair housing impediments. And I think we've shown a couple initiatives that directly respond to that assessment. So again, using performance metrics and making sure that we are transparent on what's being done and what's not being done, what's successful and what's not working, is a fundamental step to be taken.
Right.
If I may address something right quick, I think if you viewed or saw the meeting the day before last, they've also, and you brought up the point about having consultant, they have a consulting firm that Housing is working with, and they're going to do some outreach to the community during the month of January. So check your calendars or see the city's website, because they're going to have these community outreach events scheduled during the month of January. The firm also, they identified some deficiencies as well. So they will be gathering input from the community as well as going to those departments, specifically the housing department, to try to work through those issues to address some of the concerns and the deficiencies that were identified.
Okay, so Broxdale, since you're already on cue, we have a question from the Q&A. And that question is, when you apply to rent a home and they take your application fee and you do not hear from them, what can be done to stop homeowners from taking hundreds of rental applications and then denying people their money, not returning the money when they pay the application fee?
That on its face, now let me sort of draw a distinction here. I don't know that the situation that you just described is directly a fair housing issue. I know that it's a landlord-tenant issue. So what probably needs to be done, if you are unable to get any satisfaction or have that landlord, because you said a home, so I take it that the landlord is renting single-family dwellings. If they're not responsive, there are other entities that you can contact, and certainly feel free to contact our office, and we may be able to assist with that too. But you may want to contact Legal Aid Society. They have attorneys that are specifically there to assist with landlord-tenant issues. There are also other entities, nonprofits like the Texas Tenants Union that assist people throughout the area with landlord-tenant issues. But again, you can call our office and we can call to try to see how best to assist you. Again, I'm not sure, based on the brief description, that it falls within fair housing. It may, but I don't have enough information to really directly say whether it is or not, but it definitely sounds like a landlord-tenant issue.
Where can we get more information on the protected classes? That's another question in the chat, Mr. Higgins.
You can contact our office. We can send out information, or you can go to our website. You can go to the city's website and then put in the search engine City Fair Housing, or you can just Google Dallas, City of Dallas Fair Housing Office, and it'll pop right up.
You got a lot of questions in the Q&A. You may want to get on here.
Yeah.
Yeah. So another one is, when it comes to the source of income being a protected class in Dallas, does it help against HCV and public housing tenants who may not qualify for the debt to income ratio as it relates to rental criteria of public and private landlords?
It may. So again, without having specifics, yeah, it very well may. So again, it would depend on the situation and the specific act that was imposed upon the person who's trying to exercise their source of income to meet their rental criteria.
And maybe, Alyssa, I can add a little bit to that. I think
Sure.
the issue with the lack of source of income protection is not so much the debt to income ratio, but rather the fact that the money comes from the government. And for jurisdictions who have passed source of income protection, we have seen a change in where voucher holders tend to reside. So in short, other communities who have source of income protection have seen voucher holders living in more economically and racially vibrant, diverse neighborhoods. And so I think it would be reasonable to expect that if we have this kind of shift in Texas, that we are going to start seeing a different kind of spatial patterns for voucher holders.
Okay, great. And next one is, how are Section 8 vouchers calculated? And do we see more availability for homes with the elderly and children as a part of the household? After this one, back to you, Beverly.
Okay.
Oh, okay, I can answer to that one. So I'm not sure about how Section 8 vouchers are calculated, but I can say this. The assistance is typically a household would pay 30% of their adjusted income towards the rent, and the housing authority pays the rest. So that's for who pays what in the rent formula. In terms of what is available in terms of housing supply, we have to make sure that the price that the landlord is giving a certain tenant is actually reasonable. So there are a couple rules just to make sure that the unit is not out of price and still affordable for the client. In terms of population that we serve, 51% of the folks receiving voucher assistance are actually children. And I think 44% are either elderly or have a disability. So that kind of gives you a sense of the population being served by vouchers.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Dr. Goof, I have a follow-up to that since someone asked about Section 8. There's a stereotype of who a Section 8 tenant is. Mm-hmm. Could you help educate and dispel any misinformation there is about what Section 8 is and who receives Section 8?
Sure. I think what I can say is a few years ago, I could have qualified for Section 8, minus not having citizenship. So I think the stigma around voucher is that these are the non-deserving poor or the lazy, right? And really that stigma is nonsense, to put shortly. A lot of the folks, I think 35% of voucher holders actually work, like able-bodied folks are actually working. I mean, it's tough, right? It's a lot of nonsense about people's character, flaws in terms of character. What I can say is voucher holders are your neighbors. They are the people serving you at the restaurants, and could have been me a few years ago.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So James, we have a question about gentrification. As we start to get investments into communities, we have seen with all around Dallas gentrification. So how does that play into if the banks start to really invest in the community and some of these areas are revitalized? How do we guard against that?
I mean, so that's going to be a difficult question. I mean, so what I advise, gentrification is just, they're building more expensive houses or types of developments, that are typically predominantly, white. And so in that regard, I mean, often those areas have been disinvested over the years. I mean, so the way to counteract that is to bring in some type of investment and do it gradually at a time. That's the best way to fight, particularly against it. Building houses, opening up business, you know, granting loans, particularly in those areas.
Mhm. Mhm.
And
Right.
I kind of want to add to it. It's not only, I think, the investment, as you mentioned, James,
Mhm.
has to be incremental, not to overwhelm the community with a, you know, and just a brutal injection of capital. But we also have to have the right policies in place. So there is a pretty big library of policies that could be enacted by the city to protect tenants on first right of refusal. Also, the appraisal district has something to do with gentrification. So I think there are some ways to formalize that as well on how do we protect tenant from gentrification when we want to reinvest.
Okay. So Miriam, we have a follow-up on the Section 8 voucher holders. That question is, since voucher holders are a dependable source of payment, why were not vouchers better received during COVID-19 and during the process where people were being evicted? Why was it that some people, even though they had vouchers, were still having problems with some of the landlords?
Yes, it's difficult to say. You know, I like to be confident when I have the data in the back. So anecdotally, I can say this, you know, the pandemic exacerbated a lot of the burdens on tenants, and despite the protections in place, folks were being evicted. And actually very few, at least I can say for DHA voucher holders, actually moved during the pandemic just because they had the security to stay where they are. And a lot of folks actually on the voucher program really think twice while relocating, because you may not find a unit and another landlord actually finding or accepting your voucher. But I think this question can raise like another problematic or another theme, which is what would it take for the market to respond to the stability of Section 8 from a landlord's perspective, right? And I think it's an answered question. A lot of folks are wondering whether if we provide all kind of incentive or if we provide maybe better business, we will be able to house voucher holders. And we don't know yet, you know, to what extent a certain strategy will outweigh the stigma and the discrimination against vouchers.
That's the problem.
Okay. Okay. Okay, so we have another question, and this is James. I think you can take this one. The question is, why are we encouraging financial institutions to obey the law? Why aren't our lawmakers requiring them to obey the law and comply?
So they should be obeying the law, but we must hold them accountable. And there is a breakdown of who enforces, you know, what law. You have the banking regulators, but they don't really enforce redlining or discrimination. That's going to be HUD or the Department of Justice. In a sense, they're making a referral. So that stop point is for the banking regulator. They're the ultimate decision maker. We as the community, you know, we can file those complaints and hold them accountable. So I think it's important that we, you know, we start filing those complaints, particularly like we did with the 17 banks.
Okay. Okay. So, so what you're saying is that it requires the community to be actively involved. If the community isn't actively involved in holding these institutions accountable, then they will not be accountable.
Yes. And so from a banking regulator, these guys go across the country. They don't know Dallas, just like I don't know Chicago. I mean, but we know where we live at. We know particularly where we're from. I mean, so we have to be our best advocate as far as pointing out, you know, these things that happen.
Right, right.
We had one, can people with accommodation with children be denied? I don't know, Mr. Higgins, can you answer that?
On the face of it, no, and really it's not an accommodation. Under the protected class of familiar status, a housing provider or a landlord cannot deny someone housing because there's a household with children. So any household with children 17 years of age or under have protections under the Fair Housing Act. Not only that, it does not even have to be a direct parent to child situation. It can be an aunt or an uncle that has a child and as a part of their household, or a grandparent that has a child as a part of their household, or it can be someone who's pregnant. And if the landlord sees that the person is pregnant and does not want, or makes it difficult for that person to secure housing, again, that person can file based on familiar status. Also, if you're in a situation, community, or complex where they want to steer you or direct you to a certain part of the property. Let's just say I own a complex and I have playground equipment on my apartment complex, and I think all the families with children would be happy living over there near the playground equipment. Well, some of them may not want to be over in that area. But if I only limit them to those units over there, I will have violated their rights.
And we'll follow up. How does the Fair Housing Act protect homeowners from discrimination by homeowner associations? You kind of hit on that. Can you expand a little bit? If somebody's being discriminated by the HOA?
If the HOA is imposing some type of rule or policy on a specific household or a person, because of that person's membership in a protected class, that individual has a right to file a complaint, and they should not be mistreated in that manner because of their membership in that protected class. So there can be any number of situations. Let's just say some homeowners associations that have, let's just say, swimming pools in their complex, and this could apply to apartment complexes as well. They may have rules. Children under the age of 17 must be accompanied by an adult. Well, that rule on its face is discriminatory and a violation. Now, we understand the reason behind it. They're trying to protect children and families from a child drowning. But you may have a child who's on a swim team or a lifeguard, and they can, they have the ability to be able to swim and protect themselves. So under the fair housing, what they allow these complexes to do, you can have a rule that states, and the safe zone is any child under the age of 12 or 10 must be accompanied by a strong swimmer. You cannot designate that they must be accompanied by an adult, because in doing so, you're singling out families. So it can be something as simple as that. It can be something where, based on someone's religion, we've had cases where someone of a non-Christian faith may have some symbol up hanging in their window on their door, and the homeowners association then issues them a violation or fines them because they won't take the symbol down. Again, that could be a violation of that person's rights based upon religion. So it just depends on the nature and the circumstances that individual may be experiencing at the time.
Okay, this next one is for Mr. Mcgee. What can Delta Sigma Theta do to ensure the accountability by banks with Community Reinvestment Act funds coming into our communities of colors, from our former social action chair? Then back to you, Beverly.
Okay.
I think it's number one, identifying who you bank with, asking them questions as far as what are they doing, particularly, in the communities of color. And then also keep from a visual standpoint, if you may see them out and about as far as that. And I think those questions tell you a lot, particularly about that bank, what they're doing and not doing.
Okay, we have a question and I will ask it, and it may require some interpretation, but the question is, are you seeing that individuals of different nationalities are utilizing their resources to profit off of affordable housing units and housing choice voucher participants? Does anybody want to take a? Okay.
I can try. I don't have anything that would support that statement. No. I mean,
okay, but Miriam, that in Texas, there's no requirement that landlords take accept a Section 8 voucher, and what that means, what the consequences are of that.
I'm sorry, can you repeat it one more time?
The fact that Section 8 voucher holds no protection. There's nothing that requires a landlord to accept a voucher. So if they want to live in a high opportunity area and they have a voucher, they want to live in an area close to a job that, or schools that they like, and they can't find housing, there's nothing that compels a landlord to accept the voucher.
No, unfortunately, you're right. It's a dead end. And I think the consequences are pretty obvious, is you're denying housing opportunities for folks who typically have the actual resources to lease there. That's the, let's say the simple analysis of it, but I think there is a much sobering one, which is that grand scale. We are discriminating against African-American folks, which a lot of legal scholars have looked into how source of income discrimination could have some fair housing implications. So, and it's not only that, you're also just denying access to opportunities to the next generation. So the implications are today, but also for the next generation. So, and the implications are systemic, right? When we think about how discrimination or disparities are institutionalized or government sponsored, I think source of income protection or the prohibition of source of income protection is a big monster in Texas.
Okay.
And
So
I might add to that. That's why voting is so important. If you don't vote the right people in these positions that makes laws that are going to impact you, you're going to end up with these types of consequences. Here in the state of Texas, okay, we've had a significant increase over the last decade that the census shows a significant increase in the number of people here in the state. Well, the state legislature, they added and they've gone in and created these districts, primarily down, I think, near Houston, but they're predominantly white and predominantly conservative. So that's why, again, you know, a whole lot of times we sort of take for granted the right to vote and taking the time to vote. But if you don't vote, then you're going to end up with these types of policies where we're sort of left out in the cold, or we're not able to take full advantage of opportunities that other people are able to take advantage of. These people, they're not interested in seeing Section 8 or source of income as any type of protection here in the state of Texas. And so if we don't participate in the system, we're not going to see any change. And it starts at the lower level, not only at the national level for voting for president or vice president. Where it really matters is in these local elections. That's where you see change come, where we can vote people in who are going to vote in and speak to the interests that concern you. So if you want to talk about what can you do, what can we do as individuals, first thing we need to do is go out and vote, and then encourage our friends, our family, and relatives, and everybody we know to go out and vote.
Great, thank you, Broxdale. So we have another question for Dr. Iguf. During your presentation, you mentioned that there have been commitments to provide equitable redistribution of housing investment to underserved communities. Do you feel that these commitments will be fulfilled and have a significant impact in underserved areas?
And I think I'm going to clarify something very quickly. So the policy that we designed to provide COVID-related housing assistance specifically accounted for the fact that underserved communities rarely see resources. And so we accounted for that and provided housing assistance, which showed, comparing to like a space neutral or a race neutral policy, that the way we've done it allowed to actually reach vulnerable population. But that's just within the confine of the pandemic, right? It's just a program that exists for the purpose of addressing housing issues because folks could not pay their rent. But now we have to develop these kind of policies and programs at the city level and state level, right? So I can't really speak to that because I don't work for the city, but we do work together. But I think it kind of looked back to the comment that was made about the housing policy. This is something that we're going to have to demand, right? How the policies in place or the program design specifically tie to segregation, specifically tie to poverty concentration. And if you are unable to demonstrate that there is a direct link, an intentional one between the two, then you are missing target again.
Right. So I have another question for you, Dr. Iguf. And that question is, how can a person obtain more information about the program you spoke to us about during your presentation?
So we haven't had the chance to advertise it yet because we wanted to not create too much confusion for the entire voucher program. And we have put the program on hold because of the pandemic, but soon we're going to have a page open to explain in greater details how the Children First North Texas program works.
Okay, and I have a follow-up because one of the things that we talked about previously when the studies were done is that a person's child's destiny should not be determined by the zip code that they live in. And we know that if you look within the Dallas area, North Texas region, if you look at things like health disparities, you can find some zip codes where the life expectancy is 20 to 25 years shorter than it is in other zip codes. And so could you speak to that? We're not just talking about, when we talk about housing, that we're talking about other things as well. So could you expand on that a little bit?
Sure. And for those who are interested in understanding fair housing, you know, fair housing is not just concerned with housing, it's also concerned with access to opportunities, because you have to understand that depending on where you reside, you will or will not have access to certain amenities, to certain school performing more or less. And there is abundant research that shows that depending on where you grow up, the implications can vary in terms of income over time, health, education, let's say interaction with the prison system, right? And that is because of those spatial inequities and the compounding issues that you can find in a neighborhood. And I kind of want to extend on that. I earlier talked about recaps, right? Those racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty. When we conducted the assessment of fair housing, we have seen that not only these neighborhoods were characterized by extreme poverty level, extreme racial segregation, but also a much lower access to healthy grocery store, a much lower access to affordable transportation options, right? So you're really talking about just the cumulative barriers that come with living in one neighborhood, but also the cumulative impact over time for you today, loss of income and loss of opportunity, as well as your children. And I'm going to be quick, but somebody gave me a very good question that is, okay, you've talked about providing a super voucher to folks living in recaps, but what about investing in these neighborhoods? And absolutely, you can't just relocate people, right? You can't be monolithic. You have to further or support neighborhood choice and housing choice, but you also have to invest very intentionally in a targeted way in these neighborhoods who are, again, are not seeing investment coming their way.
Right. Thank you. So I have a follow-up for James on that, because I know that, James, you've done some research on issues like food deserts. And can you speak to the issue of why segregated areas, and particularly the southern sector, suffers from having food deserts in so many neighborhoods?
So yes, I mean, so overall, it starts with disinvestment. There have been a loss of population from that aspect. It's really more people per square mile. That goes back to, you know, building houses. And then also from an economic standpoint, there's a belief in the grocery store world that if you're rich, you may eat more food than if you're poor, but we pretty much, you know, eat the same amount of food. But I think it's, you know, as far as the solution, we have to create our own, you know, models and start investing, particularly in our own areas.
Right. And so what we do have in the southern sector, it seems to be a proliferation of dollar stores. So by having the dollar stores, are the dollar stores, when you look at them on balance, are they good for the community, or do they have a negative impact on the community?
Is that for me?
Yes.
So overall, the concentration of dollar stores has a negative, you know, impact, you know, on the community. It's just like the concentration of most things. And what you typically find is grocery stores, bigger grocers, will not come particularly into your community, where there are Family Dollar, Dollar Generals, or a lot of convenience stores for that regard.
And why is that?
It's not within those grocery stores, you know, model. And then from a Dollar General standpoint, from their standpoint, they're going into, you know, because they're going into these particular markets because they know the grocery stores are not going to come. So it's profitable for them, but as far as the community, you go back to the health disparities and things like that, you're going to see that the byproduct of that, of not fresh foods, or I mean, in a sense, you know, food deserts, banking deserts, you know, all kind of disparities within the community.
Right. Okay. Okay. So I've got one more question, and then I'm going to turn it back over to Elisa. What about the in-between populations? You make too much for the low-income area, but not enough to live in a one-bedroom that costs $1,400. What resources are available to this group? Does anyone want to jump in and take that question?
So so there's been, as of, I guess, recently, probably in the last 2 or 3 years, there's been more attention, particularly, you know, to this. And this is from an area median income standpoint. You know, you make over the 80% area median income, and it's up to 120. I mean, so that's in which you don't qualify for any type of down payment assistance or any help, but you don't make quite enough money to come up with these big down payments or other things in which you may need. And so City of Dallas is one of the ones in which, from a housing standpoint, they start to concentrate, you know, on this area. I mean, but it is a particular, you know, problem, and we need to bring more attention to it.
I think one other part of the potential solution is to pay attention to the housing stock and the diversity of the housing stock, right? We tend to not really preserve affordable housing or middle-class housing, and we tend to just revamp everything and build very high-end apartment, and Mike mentioned, which is of course out of reach for me, and I'm sure a lot of other people. And so we have to, like, again, take that dual approach of providing programs and incentive and support for those in that bracket of the income spectrum, but also making sure that the housing stock doesn't turn, that we preserve affordable housing options.
Okay, looks like we have, can housing be denied to VAWA applicants as it relates to income or background?
So I think that's the Vawa, victim of, I think it's domestic violence or so, and maybe Broxdale might know better.
Anyone who is a victim of any type of abuse or stalking or things like that, certainly they have protections under the Violence Against Women's Act. And for those of you who are familiar with it, it was enacted in 1994. And actually, you know, not oddly enough, but certainly one of the key points that we see here today, President Joe Biden was the one who sponsored the bill. At the time, it did not address housing though, so it's going through several reiterations. But anyone who is a victim or is being abused in some manner, if they're being, let's just say, issued violations or threatened with eviction because their partner or significant other is causing issues on that property, that person can certainly file a complaint under the Fair Housing Act, and their rights very well may have been violated. They cannot use that as an excuse, housing providers, to say, okay, you're causing a disturbance, you're being a nuisance, we're having these problems, because you can't deal with this, you have to go. No, they cannot be denied because they're a victim of some type of partner, spousal abuse, or anything related to those types of situations.
Great. Last question we have, banks are the biggest holders of low-income apartment housing, and they think that is sufficient to meet their CRA responsibilities. We want CRA funds invested in the purchase of homes for low-income families. How do we change the direction of CRA funds and hold the banks accountable? It's probably back to you, Mcgee or Higgins, or.
So from a national level with the federal regulators, there's been some talk as far as them not receiving incentives for basically financing those apartment projects in high crime areas. From a local standpoint, what we've been doing is, you know, try to create a fund that banks can invest into to build, you know, again, for sale, affordable housing. And for right now, honestly, banks just take the easy way out and invest into the apartments. And, you know, from a city standpoint, goes back to the study, is that, you know, the city kind of follows suit as far as those opportunities for financing. Is heavy on the apartment side, and not particularly for the housing side, for those, you know, and like Miriam mentioned, as far as the different types of housing at different price points.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yes, I think we had a follow-up from, I saw something in the chat from a millennial saying that many millennials are in that boat of not being poor enough to qualify for any kind of special consideration. but not being able to obtain housing, good, decent housing. And so would anyone like to speak to that whole issue of what do we do with the quandary of millennials who have seen like they've come out of school and entered the workforce at a time when housing costs have skyrocketed?
Mhm. I mean, it's a loaded question, and I'm part of the millennials, so I feel the pain. I think it kind of goes back to what we've mentioned earlier, right? Is to have a diversity, like a diverse housing stock that serves different kind of people on, along the income spectrum. Nowadays, we tend to focus, is a big word, but focus on the lower tail of the income spectrum with the HUD and what a housing authority does. And of course, we cater to the higher tail by providing all the incentive and building a housing stock that fit their economic capability. I think it's a loaded one because it's not just a matter of what is available today. We also have to think of minimum wage and how much folks are making, and do we have employment opportunities that are actually serving locals? Again, it's a loaded one.
Right. Okay, and one thing that we have not really covered, we've talked about housing discrimination and we've talked about redlining. We really have not talked about predatory lending. And so which one of the panelists would like to tell us, when we talk about, James, since you were in the banking industry, can you tell us what is meant by the term predatory lending?
Predatory lending, payday lenders. They're heavily excessive, in lower income communities of color, and they're the #1 predatory lender that's technically still legal out there. In a sense, what they do is seek to have high interest rates and crazy terms, and they kind of focus on the lower income people. And so that's the simple way to say it.
But as it pertains to mortgage loans, is that I understand during the housing crisis of 2007, 2008, one of the revelations that came out is that many people who lost their homes, they were in these adjustable rate mortgages where they started out with a low rate, but after 3 or 4 years, the rates would balloon up to a much higher rate. And so you would have people whose payments would either double or triple. Are banks still making those types of loans as far as you know, or is that pretty much been put on the shelf after we had the housing debacle?
So yes, banks still do make those types of loans. Just the volume of those, they're not available. There are not as many of those loans being made, but there's a lot of safeguards in place to actually over-inform, if you're going to take that type of loan, these are going to be the payments for this certain time, and then they're subject to go up. And so that's the reason why you don't hear a lot about it, particularly like you did, back then.
Okay. So Broxdale, if someone believes that they've been a victim of predatory lending, like based on their credit score and their income, they believe that they're being charged a higher rate because of their race or because of their national origin or what have you. What would your office do in response to that? Would you take a complaint from someone who believed they were being discriminated against?
Yes, ma'am. Under those circumstances, we would. And then we would have to gather sufficient evidence to prove and meet the burden that they have been targeted. Basically, predatory lending, and to sort of touch on, Mr. Mcgee was right. It deals with these institutions that will target certain segments of society or certain groups. They find them, they're vulnerable, and then they will then try to take advantage of these people because they know that they can't get loans, the standard regular loans at a bank or something like that. So they specifically target certain neighborhoods or certain groups, trying to entice them to apply for these loans. And then, as Mr. Mcgee said, especially if they're not only trying to purchase a home, but even if they're trying to refinance, then if there's an adjustable rate mortgage or a refinancing program, those rates will increase on them. And then they find themselves in a position where they're about to lose the home. but these are institutions and people who are really looking for that vulnerable class or vulnerable victims that they can take advantage of to increase, their coffers and increase their profits.
Okay, thank you. One last follow-up to James, and then I'm turning back over to Elisa. What kind of person say I'm a millennial, I'm not a millennial, but if there were someone who were interested in purchasing a home and they were ready to make that move, what would a person do to ensure that they're getting the best mortgage rate?
So the rates are really low right now. I think it's on the buyer side, just be informed as far as, there's a lot of home buyers education out there. So take advantage of those, give it a trusted, loan officer, and then on the realtor side, a trusted realtor. As far as on the predatory rates, again, there's a lot of there's a lot of eyes and attention on that, so that doesn't really happen particularly anymore.
Right. Okay.
Like, we got a few more questions we're going to take, and we may not cover all. We asked the panelists, look at the Q&A. We got some more. I'm just going to try to hit a couple more. Christina Brody asked, the gentrification taking over our communities, how can we obtain more information about preserving our communities? For example, buying homes in the southern sector through auctions and hubs, etc. James.
So the number one thing I'm going to say, we have a tremendous airship problem in Southern Dallas. Get some type of will transfer upon deed to make sure those properties are transferring, to somebody, to a person, and not being lost to the tax sale. Again, buy property, particularly in the southern sector, even if you don't want to live there, buy some of the commercial buildings, buy some of the vacant lots, buy some of the, housing. And then we have a lot of land. We have a shortage of builders and developers. I'm a banker turned nonprofit guy. I didn't know anything about building 3 years ago, but I do now because it's a passion of mine. So in a sense, get into the game and educate yourself.
Yeah, it's like getting a seat at the table.
I would add one thing though, make sure that you understand all the laws and regulations related to that, because you can easily, there's so many people, and we've seen this time and time again, they will hear about a friend or they have a relative that's bought some property and they are making all this money. Everything isn't as easy as it appears. So please, I implore you, make sure that you understand the business and you understand all the laws, regulations that will impact what you're doing, whether you're, thinking about buying a home to rent it, flip it, or whatever the case is. That's what your interest is.
Yes,
Right.
we always want to seek professional advice, talk to someone like Mr. Broxdale Mcgee, a realtor attorney, if you're making a purchase in real estate. So you don't want to jump out there without, skilled advice. Les Jones asks, is it possible to start our own credit unions with our own community with the right investors? For example, if we have 500 members who signed up for a $25 fee to open their own account, could we start something in our own community? That's a good question. Dr. Agoof, what do you think?
I am not quite sure, and probably the expert on bank regs is going to be James. But I would think that, first, the spirit, yes, sometimes you have to find the solution yourself when the system doesn't give it to you. But I'm not really proficient on what would it take to get a bank started. The barriers are probably pretty high, James. What do you think?
Mhm.
Yes, the banks, so the barrier to start a bank is, extremely high as far as that. I think thanks to Obama, there are some real estate crowdfunding platforms that are out there. There are some in which none of them are in Dallas. I think that's an excellent opportunity to take advantage of that. And in a sense, you can pool money together, review deals, and you can have multiple people, fund it. So I think that's an opportunity as well to curate something, here in Dallas and to help Southern Dallas or any area within the Metroplex that you're passionate about.
Oh, great. Is affordable housing the same as low income housing?
No, it depends on how much money you make. Really.
So like, yeah, like low income housing is typically for folks making a certain amount of money, right? So if you're a one person household, if you make more than, I don't know, $15,000, then you would not qualify as really low income. So you have like set numbers that would qualify as low income. But affordable housing is a function of who's looking at the house, right? What is affordable to me may not be affordable to somebody else, or vice versa. But usually the question of affordability, oh, I love that. The question of affordability is used so freely, but we have to be careful about it, right? Because the rule of affordability is if you spend more than 30% of your income towards your housing cost, you're a cost burden, right? But if you make $1 million a month and you spend 30% of your income towards housing, you still have plenty money to buy food and all the extra stuff, right? So I think we have to just be like, read kind of between the lines when we're talking about affordable housing to serve who? That's what needs to follow behind it.
Right, right. That's a good point. If I could ask a follow-up, because there's been a lot in the news recently about low-income housing tax credit properties. And I think in one of the Banking Below 30 reports, it talked about how banks, and there was a question in the chat about that, how banks are fulfilling their CRA responsibilities by building LIHTC housing. And so is that a problem? Is concentrating LIHTC housing in one part of the city, does that lead to any particular problems?
I think that it can. Yeah, if you're going to just saturate a community with LIHTC properties, naturally it's going to have an impact. I don't think you can get around that. So, we certainly need to strategize how to be more balanced in our approach and how we review applications and requests to grant these tax credit to the different developers, certainly those that approach the city.
I think it's also a difficult question, Beverly, because the researcher in me cannot not talk about that research that came out. I'm not saying we can generalize the findings, but as a rule of thumb, we know that concentrating low-income families in already poverty-stricken areas is against fair housing, right? I think there's a consensus around that. But some economists have found that LIHTC development could act as a catalyst for economic development in lower income neighborhoods. So I'm not saying that we can just use that statement and say, we're going to use LIHTC to revitalize high poverty neighborhoods, but it's an argument that those making decisions around LIHTCs and where do we develop have to be ready for too.
Well, let me ask you this. Instead of, we tend to think of LIHTC or no LIHTC, but why aren't there more mixed income developments done where you have a mixture of incomes rather than concentrating on just low income?
Affordable units.
And I think we have an issue with LIHTC, which is probably like symptomatic of a very tight rental market and the way that the voucher program doesn't work as intended. So meaning because of the source of income discrimination. But from the research that I have done, we have found that a lot of LIHTC development, which are intended to be mixed income, tend to be in majority occupied by low-income families, including voucher holders. Because voucher holders can go to LIHTC, you can't refuse them to lease in a LIHTC. And so the hybrid or the mixed nature of the LIHTC get lost because of the lack of source of income protection and just the tightness of the market that we're in. So, LIHTCs are like super difficult housing engine to control. And then the politics around it, of course, beautiful.
Yeah, right.
We're going to go ahead and wrap up. And so we closed out each webinar with kind of giving the panelists a final word to empower the community to take this knowledge that they've gained tonight. Just final words to give our, sorority members and our public here some words of advice and encourage them in the future how to apply this information. And we hope to have a part 2 of this in April in person. So look out for it. And we really want to thank you all. And we'll just ask each panelist to just give some final words to everyone here tonight. We'll start with you, Mr. Barksdale.
Well, thank you so much, ma'am. I want to again thank the ladies of Delta for inviting me to participate in this healthy discussion. I think, there was some certain great information, valuable information. I just hope that your listening audience was able to take away at least one thing that will be of benefit from them. We talked about so many different issues and items here, but if you can, grab hold of one thing that will be able to benefit you, in whether you're trying to rent a home or trying to purchase a home, hopefully your time was not wasted here tonight. So again, if there are any fair housing issues, certainly, look to our office to assist you with that. I can even give you a number that you can call if you have something to write with, 214-670-3247. And again, some questions, they may not be lend itself totally to fair housing. They may be more landlord tenant related if it's a rental situation, but we'll certainly try to provide the best assistance that we can. Thank you again. Merry Christmas to you all.
Thank you. We see you in your holiday spirit. Next, like the best. Next, Mr. Mcgee, final words, please.
I'd just like to thank the opportunity to speak, here today. And I think for me, I think it's, be part of the change in which you want to see in our community. And so that's all I have.
Dr. Agu.
Again, thank you for allowing me to speak to you all tonight. I would say maybe the thing I want to leave you guys with is to be the agent of change for your community, right? Sometimes you don't have to wait for the federal government or local government to go your way. Sometimes you have to build the solution yourself and inspire other people to do the same. I would say, last one, second one, keep people accountable and honest, right? The mere fact that you say you want to do something doesn't mean you're doing it. So sometimes you have to ask for proof, for evidence that the homework has been done.
That's very true. So you all have heard some great speakers. Like you said, speak up, call out, reach. Sarah Beverly, do you have anything? And then we're going to let Judge Nash say a few words and then back to our president.
Okay, I would just like to thank our great panelists, and I think we should give them a round of applause because they did an outstanding job. And let this not be the end of the conversation. As we said, April is National Fair Housing Month, and we hope to have some type of outreach event during the month of April. So we hope to engage all of you again. And remember, just as Dr. King fought all those years in 1968, when we make progress, there's always a backlash. And so we have to have the resolve to always to continue the fight. So that's my charge to everyone, that we continue the fight. Thank you.
Judge Nash.
Thank you, Sarah Patterson and Sarah Davis, for an amazing night. Thank you to our panelists again for taking your time. According to the chat, this was a wonderful event. It was so insightful and so engaging. And so I want to thank each of you for taking your time out, and we really appreciate it.
Madam President, you ready to close us out? Thank you all for
Yes,
joining.
ma'am. Let's see, am I on? All righty. Yes. Thank you for your attention to become aware of fair housing, knowing how to identify discriminatory practices or rates by the banks, and to become aware of what the future holds for us. The Dallas Alumni Chapter is grateful for your attendance on tonight's webinar. I would like to thank the expert panelists for such an outstanding job in this webinar discussion. To our audience, again, thank you for your participation. This ends the webinar, and as a friendly reminder, continue to mask up and stay safe. Enjoy your evening and good night. Happy holidays.
Thank you.